All right, everyone. Welcome to tonight's debate. The participants are two members of the American Visionary Party. The member for government term limits is Jonathan from Nebraska, and David Lewis from Arkansas is the opposed. The format is parliamentary, and you may now start, Jonathan. Let me know when you're ready.
Thanks, Zach. So I'm Jonathan. I'm one of the leadership committee members for the American Visionary Party. Tonight, I'm going to be arguing in favor of a constitutional amendment that would impose non-elective term limits on Congress. So first, I want to start out by defining the two types of term limits that basically exist. You have elective term limits, which technically have always existed and will always continue to exist. They are imposed by the citizenry when they vote a politician out of office. In theory, elective term limits will be imposed on politicians on a case-by-case basis. It's not always going to be 2 terms or 3 terms. It'll just be whenever they decide they don't like the politician anymore or they think they're doing a bad job. We don't like you anymore. You don't get our votes anymore. You're out. You're done. Your terms are up. That's an elective term limit. Then there's non-elective term limits, things that are imposed by the system through laws, or in this case, through a constitutional, an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. There's no way around those kinds of term limits. Whatever the number of terms is per representative, whether it's 2 terms of 6 years or 3 terms of 6 years or 2 terms of 3 years, whatever. There's no way getting out of it. There's no way around it. When your terms are up, your terms are up. Time to go home. I will hereafter refer to both types of term limits according to the manner which I just defined them. Now, I would argue that non-elective term limits are the kind that most people think of when they hear, quote, term limits. Let me be clear. Non-elective term limits could only be imposed on Congress by an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. There is no other way. That would be effective anyway. Achieving such a feat is an immensely difficult uphill battle, and it will not be easily won. However, I do believe that it has become necessary. Non-elective term limits are the kind that I will be advocating for here tonight. So, in order to effectively argue that non-elective term limits are needed, I must first establish that the citizenry are systematically unable to or are otherwise incapable of imposing elective term limits on their representatives due to various circumstances. These various circumstances can be summarized, in my opinion, as the powers and advantages of incumbency and the state of American society. So I'm going to go through each of these points that I think are having an effect in essentially usurping democracy unintentionally. So the first is normalcy bias. When you get to the ballot box and you see a name that you recognize, you're almost automatically already going to like that name more in most cases. The idea that good press and bad press, it's all just press, familiarity. The people that have been in office for 30 years in their area, they're always going to have more familiarity. By default, it's just like, oh yeah, that guy's always been there. So, and then you have, the part that comes when, hey, they've always been there. Why should we change to somebody else? Even if they're not doing that good of a job, I'd rather keep the status quo than risk negative change by voting in somebody else. So there's always going to be that resistance in combination with that familiarity. Additionally, incumbent politicians, they've won the game before. They know how to win. They understand the system more intimately than a newcomer ever will. Additionally, incumbents have all kinds of connections in Washington and in their states. They're going to have access to tons and tons and tons of money all the time, or at least more so than any newcomer usually will ever hope to acquire. And that money thing becomes a whole bunch of other issues. With the media being the way that it is today, whoever is going to, spend more money on advertising generally is going to win. Because they're going to get their message out first. The first thing you hear about anything is generally what you're going to accept. And the next thing you hear about that, if it's not in direct line with what you already heard, you're going to be like, but I already heard this other thing, And so when the confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance sets in, you're not going to listen to other stuff as easily. It's much easier to present new information to somebody than it is to try and change their mind. So once you know something about a candidate, you're probably not going to change your mind. Or at least it's difficult to do so. By and large, the American people are complacent and apathetic when it comes to knowing their candidates. Because of this, people generally are satisfied with whatever they hear from the media that they tend to listen to. So with the amount of money that incumbents have, they're almost always going to be able to field a more aggressive mass media campaign. This has always been true and will likely always be true unless other things are changed. Then you have other stuff going on with the establishment. The hostile media climate. The likes of Twitter and Facebook have been known to ban the accounts and take down the advertisements of new political candidates in the midst of election cycles. Unless we start to see a lot more legislation like was passed in Florida that would fine these sites for banning political candidates in election cycles, I don't see that stopping. They like to pick their winners and that's it. If you exist on Facebook or Twitter, you have a big advantage. If you don't exist on Facebook or Twitter, you're kind of dead in the water. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is that way. And, all this, it all starts to add up on each other, because people don't like to go do their own research. They'll accept the first thing they hear. So social media, TV news networks, all these different things telling people stuff, they're just going to accept it as the truth, unless they go out of their way to learn something else. Now, in this past election cycle, in my congressional district, I voted for Don Bacon, who was a Republican. And I would attribute probably 70% of my reason of voting for him to him being a Republican. Sure, I saw his ads, and sure, I did some research even on both sides. I did like Don Bacon better. But then after the election, I started writing to Don Bacon. I wrote to him 10 times over the course of 3 months, and I never got a response from him. And, that kind of makes me angry. Why would I have voted for somebody that doesn't even acknowledge that I exist? I don't think I ever would have done that if I had done my due diligence before. So the fact that somebody like me who's willing to put in that kind of effort could still vote based solely on a party and not the individual, I would like to think that I stand out among people who's willing to put in effort to learn more. And even then, I didn't learn enough to know that the candidate I was voting for sucked. I didn't even think to look elsewhere. All these different things that are going on, they also discourage people from running in the first place. They think to themselves, how could I ever win against the establishment? I'm just average Joe. Even if they're the better candidate and they would be better for their constituencies, they're never going to win, or at least that's what they think. And in a lot of cases, it's true because they don't have the money, they don't have the resources, and the odds are stacked against them. And I would argue that all these points, they seem kind of subjective until I talk about this last part. I think they are proven by the fact that, the approval ratings of individual senators and representatives, as well as that of Congress as a whole, are very poor. The most notable examples are Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, who have both been in federal office for well over 30 years and both average over 50% unfavorable ratings from over 100 different polling groups. And, people like Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi are bad at their jobs and people don't like them. Why have they continued to be hired and voted for over 30 years? So my point is, all of these little advantages that I talked about, all these things going on, they add up and become very powerful in the moment that each citizen considers the ink on the ballot. If elective term limits really exist and they work, why are such unfavorable individuals still in office? I conclude that elective term limits do not work often enough in the current state of our nation.
That will be all.
Therefore,
David, it is
I
now
would
your
propose
turn.
that non-elective term limits are necessary.
All right. Thank you very much. So my name is David Lewis. I am also on the leadership here with the American Visionary Party. I am against having term limits on Congress. Earlier, John tried to define two different things. First, the elective term limits, and the second being non-elective term limits. For better clarity, I would like to propose that that we should rename these to limits, elective term limits, to limits through the people and the people's choice through voting, and non-elective term limits. That is the constitutional amendment that would need 3/4 of the states through a convention in order to be able to succeed. Now, John's already admitted that this is going to be extremely difficult to do, but I'll get back to that later. So one thing that I heard said was that citizens of the United States are incapable of choosing their proper representatives. I think the citizens are completely capable of choosing the proper representatives, but that the structure that we have right now, with the two-party system, discourages them from making their personal choice and instead forces them to make a strategic choice. Now, again, I'll speak more on that later. Now, what John's given you is a bunch of various biases, many of which sound impressive on the surface, but most of which, when dug into a little bit deeper, do not mean nearly as much as he would have you believe. So, the first, a familiarity bias. He said that a familiarity bias is that when you recognize a name of someone over someone else, that you have a bias toward them. That is true. But I would suggest it's up to the representative or the one challenging that representative to become familiar to the people. The people should know their representative. And of course, it makes sense that they would vote for the representative whom they recognize because they recognize them. The two cannot be pulled apart. Besides, term limits would not change this. Now, kind of winner's bias. So those who have won before already know how to work the system, so to speak. Well, that would be true. So why don't we stop Olympians from participating in more than one set of Olympic Games? They may have won medals before, some of them even first place before. So do we stop them from being able to try to compete again? Absolutely not. To bar someone because they have won is to remove people from the pool who are competent. So, continuing, the connections. John suggested that the connections that one has may make it easier for one to be reelected. Although this is true, those same connections can be used for better governance. It can allow for legislation to govern through diplomacy, the interaction of two different sets of people working together. So that same thing that John would suggest is a negative when we have someone who rightfully won an election is being attacked because they won the election and were able to govern well. Now, John brought up another bias. Those who raise more money are more capable or are more capable of spending that on advertising, and therefore being more known to the people, and those who spend more often win elections. I understand that. But that is because those people were able to raise more money as a whole. There are problems with our with money in politics, but as it stands right now, we fix that through changing the way that money interacts with politics, not with term limits. None of the things listed above truly change with term limits. Just means that the corporate shill you had before is not the same corporate shill that you have now. New face, same policies. Now, in all of this, successful candidates do not hurt the system that they are successful in. I would suggest you have to change that system. And this comes from a fundamental belief of mine that the American people are capable of choosing their representatives well. However, I think just right now, again, due to strategic voting that is caused by our first past the post system, that is, the person with the most votes wins no matter what, without any sort of ranked voting, as is already on our party platform, that changing the way we vote addresses almost every single one of these issues, while putting in term limits, although sounding nice, does not change anything at all. Now, so one thing that John suggested is that 70% of his voting for his representative was for the fact that he was a Republican. And I would suggest that John would have made the same 70% decision, which is a majority, no matter whose face was actually put forward. Putting up term limits just changes that face, or it would, except that John's representative has only been in Congress since 2017. He has not been a long-term member of Congress. And so, despite the story he would tell you of poor representation, he is fairly new, and term limits would have not prevented that situation. So, term limits don't fix these problems. In fact, there's another way to fix these problems, and that's by instituting instant runoff voting or other ranked voting system, or really any system other than the system that we use now, first past the post voting, which is widely considered to be one of the worst forms of structurally voting for someone. Now, that's enough of me refuting the things that John has said. I would like to bring up some points of my own. 1, a voter has a fundamental right to select one's representative. Why should we stop Mr. Good from being able to represent the people? If you like your representative, you should be able to keep him or her, and you should be able to keep him or her so long as they serve you. That is the entire point of the vote. And so, if your vote isn't being translated properly, term limits is not the solution. Changing the way we think about voting is the solution. A solution that I believe that John would already agree with. So, in John's proposal, a voter is being more limited by in their number of choices, and it's going to change the way we vote. Now, I think changing the way we vote is more likely to succeed than term limits, which, as John said earlier, is going to be an extremely difficult thing to actually pass, while instant runoff voting is being passed in major cities across the United States. So, term limits will exclude good politicians from office, leaving the party structures themselves completely intact. So the power of the election will fall even more to the two parties that we have now, and will fall even further away from the will of the people. This will strengthen two-party politics and will make harder the reforms that we are trying to make as part of this party. So term limits are not viable because we need a constitutional amendment. Every problem that he details is with the way we vote as a people, but none of this changes if we actually implement term limits. My proposal, which is to change the way we vote, solves these problems and more. So we don't need to waste our time trying to implement term limits. Term limits will also weaken third parties, as major party insiders with backroom connections will be the ones able to run for offices when seats open up. Do you think if we were to kick Mitch McConnell out of office that there wouldn't be another Mitch McConnell waiting in the wings, ready to take up his place, ready to shill for the Republicans? I would suggest there would be. Changing faces does not change the fundamental problem, which is not the people, but the policies that they hold and the parties that support them. That is, I will yield the rest of my time.
All right, you have any questions, Jonathan?
Well, so you talk about a lot of ideals, about people, they should be better about picking their representation, but they aren't. They should be looking into, who they're actually
Was there a
voting
question
for,
in that?
but they aren't.
Yeah, so what was your question?
My question? I heard somebody else talk. I'm sorry. I wondered if maybe it was
it is me, the moderator.
So,
When
yeah,
you yield time, the time's still there. You get to ask questions.
Yeah, my question is, if the people don't like their politicians, which they clearly don't, as demonstrated through the polls, why do they keep making it into office?
Because I fully believe the American people are capable of making better choices, as the way you've put it, but that their options are being limited by the same two-party system that your term limits are only going to help reinforce by forcing people to rely even more on party identity instead of individual identity. What I'm saying is that term limits doesn't.
All right, we are out of time. It is now. We now have a 2-minute recess for you guys to collect your thoughts. And in 2 minutes' time, John will be able to make his rebuttal arguments. All right, the 2 minutes time is up. Whenever you are ready, Jonathan.
Well, if I can get my camera to reorient, but it won't. Well, that's the way it is then, I guess. Maybe. I apologize. Technical difficulties.
There
There
we
we
go.
It works. Okay.
All right,
So,
your time starts now.
okay, so the first things I would respond to, I would present the idea of a power vacuum. Term limits frankly, when a president has served their 2 terms, and nobody's going to be kicking them out of office, at the end of their term, it kind of creates a power vacuum. It's an opportunity. And I think it's even more dramatic at the local level with representative and senator races. So if a senator, well, in the case where a senator or representative says, I'm too old, I'm done, I'm not running again. People who wouldn't run because they think I can't beat this person, I can't win over them, it's a waste of my time, might try to run now because they're not going to have to run against an incumbent. Their name is going to be just as known as the name of the person who the Republican or Democrat Party has been grooming in the back room to replace the person who's about to leave. You pull that new Mitch McConnell out of the back room or new Nancy Pelosi and say, okay, here's our new shill. The public has no idea who this person is. They barely know who their representatives are, let alone the person that's in the back room. So, your everyday citizen who decides I'm going to run is just as familiar, in that way. There's no advantage there. And so I just think you're going to get a lot more people to run in these kinds of scenarios. They're like, now's my time to run. The other things I would say, it's I'm going to come back to, the ideals of people doing their research and, learning, about who it is they're voting for. People aren't doing it. I wish that they were, but they aren't. Which is, and I feel like also they don't feel like they have a choice. If not the guy who's always been there, then who? Nobody else is stepping up to the plate. If the old guy gets kicked out and they're forced into that situation where they have to make a new choice and be brave and vote for somebody new, they'll rise to that occasion because they want their vote to count. They're not just not going to vote for somebody because they're both new candidates. They will vote for a new candidate. And whether that's another establishment shill or somebody completely outside of the establishment, it's an opportunity. It's not a guarantee. So, I think it's important for me to say that in going after the problem that you and I both see, David, of bad representation in this country, I don't think term limits is the whole solution, but I do think it's part of the solution. Certainly, I believe that instant runoff voting could be a very powerful thing, and I think we should absolutely go after that. But, I would ask you this question, and I'm inviting you to answer this question. If the president has term limits and that's a good thing, why should Congress not have the same? Maybe you don't think the president should have term limits. Do you believe that?
No, I do not. I think the people perfectly capable of choosing their own president.
See, now that's more difficult to deal with because I think there's a reason. I think there is reason behind limiting the amount of time somebody can serve. Because, to quote Lord Acton, power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. People that are left in power too long always become corrupt. I've never seen a situation where somebody's been in power for 30 years and they're not corrupt in some way. And I don't think there's any amount of laws or regulations you could pass to stop it from happening. And so the only way to really stop that from happening is to make them go home at some point. And so, yes, it would be forfeiting some of that right, to keep that Mr. Good in office. But I think it's worth it because by and large, we don't have a bunch of Mr. Goods in Congress. We have a bunch of Mr. Bads and Mrs. Bads that have been there for way too long, and we all know it. But and frankly, their constituencies don't even like them, but they keep voting for them anyway. And so, I recognize that, instant runoff voting can have a lot of power in solving that problem, but I don't think it will wholly solve all the problems that term limits is going after. I think the term limits on the president do a lot of good things. I think it puts fire under them. Like, oh, I've got a time limit. I got to get my stuff done before my time's up. Because I only get so much time, so I can't just wait forever and just go cycle after cycle after cycle and keep promising. Because eventually you're going to be out of time and you won't be able to get anything done that you wanted to do. There's also the aspect of, being able to cycle in new ideas, fresh ideas, and making sure that whoever's representing is actually in touch. And I know that, all of these things can be accomplished in theory with elective term limits, through, just voting people in and out of office. But I would argue it's not happening. And I don't, I guess at the end of the day, I see term limits being far more helpful than hurtful. And worst case scenario, you can repeal them later down the road when we are a better people about learning and voting and, actually participating in democracy. Because right now it's just, well, I have my right to vote and I'm going to do so completely uninformed in most cases. I can't tell you how many times I've personally looked at a ballot and gone through all the judges and deputies.
All right, your time is up. The floor is now open to David.
People that I had no idea who they were.
Thank you very much. John, I'd like to press you. I'm not going to ask you any questions, but I would like to make some statements based off of what you said in your first set of comments and then in your second set of comments. In your second set of comments, you said that the people don't know their representatives. But in your first set of comments, you said that because people know their representative's name, that there is a bias toward incumbency. Which is it, John? Do people not know their representatives, or do they know their representatives? For you have made the argument both ways, and I would suggest you have no argument either way at all. Now, you also said that the person who is running independently to challenge that party, so if we were to institute term limits, we force there to be two fresh candidates at least at some point, right? At least at certain intervals, say every other election, for instance. Well, you said that these candidates would be able to compete on equal footing, but that's simply not true because one of them has a party behind them, a party that holds way more influence than you might imagine. Or could you imagine it? Because earlier you were talking about how connections and how money hold so much power for the incumbent. Those connections and that money is still there within the party. Now it's just being attached to a new face. So you're saying that we are able to compete with that party as independents? Or are you saying that, so are we equal, or does that bias exist? Again, you have made the argument both ways. So, again, in forcing the people to make a choice, we ask the people. We don't force people to make a choice every 2 years for the House of Representatives. We ask people to make a choice every 2 years for the House of Representatives. Instituting term limits will not change the character of the American people. That doesn't make any sense. You're changing the document, not the actual character of the American people. So, are the American people going to be making any better decisions under your proposal of term limits? You've made no argument that they would. Now, the question, you used a quote, the absolute power corrupts absolutely. You're right. That's why we don't have absolute power anywhere in our government. In fact, we have handed the keys to the people, a foundation of the democracy, that we have the ability to remove those people from power, and we have the opportunity on a regular basis. If the politicians become corrupt, it is our duty and our responsibility to remove them from that office. That duty and that responsibility lies with us. It is not some foreign concept. This is the whole point of the democracy. So you're right. Someone in office for 30 years may become corrupt. And I would say, let's remove them from office by choosing to do so. Now, you've suggested that we should force people to go home. No more politics in this particular section of power for you. Why should I forfeit my right to choose Mr. Good simply so we can ensure a worse outcome? That doesn't make any sense to me. Now, then you continued on to talk about the president. You're right. The president is limited to 2 terms. This was naturally done by the American population, and it was done for well over 100 years, and then yet more, because the 2-term limit on the president only established in 1951 after Roosevelt, after leading us through the Great Depression and World War II, was unable to run for another office because he died. People cannot stay in power forever, and we have given the American people the option for who to choose from, and we give them that option every 4 years. And if they decide to change their mind, they can do so. Ultimately, we limit their choices. If we get a good president here in the United States, would you want to keep him for maybe an extra 4 years to see what more work he can get done? If you think 8 good years were fantastic, doesn't matter how much fire you have underneath you. 8 years is still a short period of time when compared to a human lifespan. 12 years may be more applicable for the job that needs to be done. So then you made the most baffling comment of all, that we could institute term limits, but then repeal them later when we're a better people. What you've done, my friend, is insult the American people by suggesting that they are incapable of governing themselves, when what I am saying is that they are capable of governing themselves if we gave them the right system by which to do so. And term limits, as you said and you just admitted, are not part of that, because else we would keep them permanently. So you have just made an argument against term limits by admitting that they should only be temporary. We either have permanent term limits because they're right for society, or we do not have term limits at all. And I would suggest the American people are more than capable, when given the right system, again, which is already part of our party planks, for them to be able to choose. Forcing new ideas by forcing in new people, though, that doesn't even correlate. What you are trying to do is a good thing. You're trying to improve the representation that the American people have. But I am truly afraid that you do not understand the full ramifications of the thing that you are proposing.
That's fair.
And I do not have any questions for John.
I don't.
I yield the rest of my time.
I don't say anybody should. I didn't say we should remove term limits later. I simply am open to the idea of removing them. I would not say we'd have to. I think they should stay, but for the sake of peace, I think we should always.
Zach, Zach, did I ask John a question?
No, but you forfeit the rest of your time.
Ah, got it. Understood. So go ahead, John. I apologize.
No, you're okay. I'm just, the statistics from the polls, they indicate that the people are not choosing to remove bad people from office. It's not because they are speaking out of both sides of their mouth in saying that they like this person, but they answer on the poll that they don't. It's because there aren't more options. And frankly, the competition needs to be being had within the parties themselves. I'm not saying some random Joe Schmo from the street is going to come in and win and beat the Republican. I'm saying Joe Schmo joins the Republican Party or the Democrat Party and wins the primary and beats out everybody else. The competition that goes on in primary elections doesn't happen when you have incumbents. There is no competition going on there. It's in presidential elections. If they won their first term, there isn't a primary for the person in office. The party behind that person in office just says, well, they're going to run again for our party. They just will, And so on the representative side and senator side, you're not having these primary races in each state when there's an incumbent. There's no need for it. They just say it's already predetermined. This is who's going to run on our ticket. That's where the competition is going to be had. So when I say Joe Schmo off the street is going to run, they're going to run within the party structures and win in the primaries to make their way to the ballot. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I yield time.
All right. I will now open up the floor for questions to both of the participants.
Are we making concluding statements?
That was supposed, David, you're supposed to include your concluding statements in that.
Understood. Nope, that's fine then. I'm more than willing to take questions then.
Did we have questions in the chat room? I actually can't see them.
We don't have any questions in the chat room yet, although we're getting some.
Okay. Zach, was your intention to read the questions?
I'm about to read one right now.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure we understood what we were doing.
Okay, so this is a question by player AR. Do you both support the Electoral College?
You can go first on that one, David.
Absolutely. I do support the Electoral College, though I do think that we could, I am open to the idea of partially reforming it. I am okay with the Electoral College because it allows the state to decide for itself how it would wishes to allocate its electors. Many states do something that I disagree with, which is voting by block, but it is up to the legislature of each state to determine how they vote. Believe it is Nebraska and Maine that actually split their vote, and I think that to be a more equitable system, and I do promote that. However, as a whole, I do promote the Electoral College as it helps bring balance to the states.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with everything David just said there. I think winner take all systems in states like California and Texas, well, and all states, frankly, but those are the worst offenders in my mind. I think it's a very bad thing, because essentially, if you're not a part of the majority in your state, your vote really does count for nothing in most cases. I think it's far better for, California and Texas to split up their electoral votes in a more proportional to their population kind of way. That's all I would say about that.
All right. So CMTQ62 asks, if term limits were applied, how long would each congressman or congresswoman be able to serve? I believe that's for you, John.
Yeah, I would go with the same proposal that many senators and representatives have made. Once upon a time, it was called Senate Joint Resolution 1, I believe in the 116th Congress. You can look that up, but it was 2 terms of 6 years for members of the Senate, which would be a total of 12 years served at maximum. And then for members of the House of Representatives, it would be 3 terms of 2 years, so 6 years apiece. That's the way it would work.
All right. And Dr. Seuss says, in regards to term limits and possibly abolishing them, John, don't you think that would open the door for a totalitarian regime, somewhat in the case of Putin?
You mean like if we removed term limits from the office of the presidency? Probably, but it's not to be too doom and gloom, but we kind of already live in a little bit of that under the current system. I think we have a lot of illusion of choice, and that's not due to the absence or existence of term limits. I think that's due to a lot of other things going on. But certainly inviting people to stay in office forever, I think, has an effect on that. I don't think it necessarily would be causal in most cases, because in the case of the presidency and in the case of Congress, I think we are capable as a people sometimes in voting bad people out of office, but other times I'm not so sure. I think there's too many small advantages stacked up that make it impossible to choose anything else but what's already there. So yeah, that's how I would answer that.
All right. So Doug W. asks, what will you do about rampant amounts of gerrymandering that may misrepresent the majority of a country's population? Do you believe that if gerrymandering was eliminated, it would be easier for the average American to truly remove someone they dislike?
I want you to answer, David. I think you might know more than
Sure. Sure, I'll answer this question. There are many things wrong with the way we translate people's actual desires into representation, and gerrymandering is one of those pieces. Gerrymander districts are a terrible thing, and I do not know of a good way to go about it other than to force some sort of bipartisanship on the issue. But seeing how twisted American politics has become, I do not trust either of the parties with that responsibility, nor to work together in such a way that would allow future third parties to be able to join in on that conversation. I think the best way to handle gerrymandering is to first fix the way that we vote. Again, using some sort of ranked choice voting would be my personal preference. And that through that, we see the development of alternative parties. And through the coalition of alternative parties, perhaps with one of the 2 major parties backing the initiative, to rework all the districts in the United States, or to come up with some new system that does not rely on the two major parties as they now stand. Having regionalism and having more parties will help resolve this issue just on its outset. It's one thing to collect populations into sections of red and blue. It's another thing entirely when you have yellow, purple, and green thrown into the mix.
I have no comments. Still with us, Zach?
I am waiting for the player AR is typing something right now. Waiting for it to come through.
Okay.
All right. Can we constantly trust the people to remove a bad elected official without term limits? Lobbyists and crap legislation members exist, yet they aren't voted out.
I mean,
I imagine this is for you, David.
yeah, okay.
I would answer that it's a fundamental assumption of democracy that we are able to. This democracy was built for a moral people, a people who are capable of choosing their own representatives. I truly believe that people are capable of it, and that they will be able to do so again once the system opens up to allow them to do so. And I don't think that term limits is part of that overall solution. So I am an advocate for changing many, many things, but instituting term limits on our legislators, I don't think is part of that solution. I do trust the American people. I don't trust the current system that we have, and I don't think that term limits will make me trust it anymore.
So I'm sorry, I just got a little question for you, David, just to kind of invite some discussion here. How do you think that instant runoff voting would affect your Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi types? Would it prevent them from ever being in office that long with those kinds of approval ratings that they have?
I believe that it would remove them from office. So we remember that each election does not stand alone. So it's not like, for example, in Mitch McConnell's case, it's not that the Libertarian Party would spring up overnight and then overthrow Mitch McConnell, but rather that the Libertarian that people who could seriously say, I prefer the Libertarian candidate, and then I want Mitch McConnell over a Democrat, right? That would be a ranked choice system. In that system, people would be able to say, hey, the Libertarians got 10% of the vote this time, and Mitch McConnell may still win. But then the next election occurs, and all of a sudden people say, man, we still really hate Mitch McConnell, and you get another 10% that jump into the race. Now you have 20% for the Libertarian, and Mitch McConnell is dropping fast. That's the point, is that it's able to show people that there are other options out there, and that their vote is not wasted when they show their preference for that other thing. This will allow parties to be able to actually grow, to be able to attract people who will invest into them. And since we're fixing the problem of the spoiler effect in general, we should see incremental improvements in this. Now, is it going to change overnight? I don't think it will. But I don't think it will change overnight, but that's why I'm here, so that I can work every day to make it a little bit closer.
So I just want to say some stuff. I was willing to, talk about and advocate for term limits in this discussion, because I understand a lot of you listening are in support of term limits. I think it's some 81% of Americans. I think you said to me earlier, David, that's the most recent number I've heard, are in support of term limits. But, it is a very uphill battle. It's a very difficult thing to do. So I really hoped that, we could have this discussion here to kind of lay out the whole issue, because I think we can achieve a lot of the things we hope to achieve with term limits, with something that's easier to implement. And that's not to say I don't think term limits would do anything good, because I do think they would do something good, but they are very difficult to implement. The instant runoff voting, ranked voting that we keep talking about, is a very powerful thing, and can change a lot of things very quickly. Well, relatively speaking, politically, very quickly. But yeah, so I think I'm still of the mindset that term limits are a good thing, but it's not. It was never going to be the first thing that we would have ever accomplished in any realm, just because of how difficult it is to get past. That's all I would say.
All right. Well, Rez, I'm not sure if you heard me because I apparently disconnected there due to internet crapping out on me. But ResCore asked, isn't calling this nation a democracy inaccurate?
John, if would you like to take this, or would you like me to take this first?
No, you go ahead.
All right. So this nation is a democracy. It is not a direct democracy. Each person holds a vote. Each person does not hold a direct vote. We choose our representatives, and our representatives vote on our behalf. We are more specifically a constitutional mixed republic, a representative republic at that. So mixed constitutionalism, representative republic, is the most accurate thing that we could say about us. But all of those are democracies. They're not direct democracies, but they are democracies all the same. Just as all squares are technically rectangles, but not every rectangle is a square. So not every democracy is going to look exactly like ours, but ours is a democracy all the same.
I have nothing to add to that. That's perfect.
All right, we got another question coming in. All right, Player R asks, does the majority dictate what's right or wrong? If the people elect someone that hates the Constitution, does that make it okay, basically?
I would suggest that the will of the majority does not trump the Constitution. That is the point of the Constitution. Now, a vast supermajority may be able to edit the Constitution, but I would suggest they should not do so in such a way that would violate the foundational assumptions of the Constitution, based in human liberty and in natural rights. Those natural rights do not change however many people tell you that you are wrong. Period. They're natural rights. You have them whether anyone else agrees with you or not. So if a majority were to say, no, we don't think that you have a right to speak, I would say, I don't care. It's my natural right to be able to do so. Those natural rights may not be violated, not by the government in any form. No government should be allowed to violate that. And so that's how I'd answer the question: is a majority can be wrong, and in fact, a majority is often wrong. But we do assume some things about a majority, and that a majority is still a majority and holds some authority because of it. So a majority can be wrong, but it is one of the assumptions of our democracy that they are not always wrong, and that they're less often wrong. And even more so in our mixed constitution, we our representative republic, we put an extra step in between. So we don't say that we don't have the downfall of direct democracy. Our job is to choose people who we think can govern well and will not screw us over in the process. And those are the people who actually write the laws. So there's an extra step in there that should make it a little bit more difficult for a majority to just be way off on something. And that's, again, these are all theories. These are all assumptions we make about democracy, even just by participating in it.
Yeah. I would just kind of restate, that it's kind of there are certain truths that are self-evident, that just because a majority doesn't think they're true anymore doesn't mean they aren't true. You could have a majority say gravity isn't real, but that doesn't mean it isn't. That water can drown you. It's still true even if you don't think so. So just because a majority, says one thing or another does not necessarily make it true or right. I don't think majorities really have really much power at all in the deciding of what is moral and what is true and what is right. Because those things, they're kind of incorruptible. They are what they are, and they aren't what they aren't. Yeah.
If I may, I want to tag something onto that. Majorities write laws. They don't write morality. There's a difference.
All right, and since we are now at 7 o'clock and CMTQ got his question in, if not term limits, what steps could we take for removing a long-standing unpopular congressman and promote a third-party representative? And also, if I may suggest, after this point, we lift the mute so everyone can all discuss what everything was heard here and keep going from there.
Get involved. Do your research. Don't vote for people that you don't like. There's a lot of, I agree with everything that David said regarding the ideals of what the American people should be doing. My only point was to say that generally they aren't. And that too is a problem that I wish to solve. I think, as a movement, as a party, until we've gotten every single person in this country to take personal responsibility for what's going on in their county, in their governments, we haven't succeeded yet. Because that's really what it takes to, not to be cringe or anything, but create a truly utopian society when everybody's involved, everybody's engaged, everybody's responsible. If there's a bad person in office, we're responsible for that. If there's a good person in office, we're responsible for that too. If the laws of our nation are great, that's our responsibility. That's our fault, in a good or bad way. So how do we, if not term limits, well, it could be term limits in my opinion still, but for that, any of these things that we could be doing to happen, we have to be involved. We have to be active and engaged.
I'd like to tag on to that and say that I happen to know of this great little startup organization that demands that we change something about the way that we have our representation. It's called the American Visionary Party. A lot of you may have already heard of it. So that's why I'm here. I'm here because I think we can actually make a difference. That this is the point why any of us are here, is that we can do better with our representation.
Well, that was a wonderful note to end on. The debate is now concluded. I now open everything up just for everyone to discuss it amongst themselves. I think you both did a fantastic job, and thank you for working so hard on each of your arguments. That was fantastic.
Well, thanks, Zach. I needed the pat on the back. David beat me to death, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Zach, for moderating today's debate. Really appreciate it.
Same.
All right. I'm gonna go eat, but if I may recommend, we lift the mute so everyone can discuss everything.
Yeah, how would
Your
we go
mute
about
should
that?
be lifted.
Oh, so everybody can just unmute themselves if they wanted to say something or ask a question?
I think so. If anyone would like to try, please do so now, and I'll correct the permissions if it doesn't work.
It says they're server muted, so I'm gonna undo that.
Okay.
Oh, I just saw somebody unmute themselves.
Hey, you need to leave and then rejoin.
Okay, everyone leave and rejoin if you want to participate in the discussion.
Okay.
Thank you very much, all. I'm going to end up having to. I'm going to have to step away for at least a minute. If any of you catch me, feel free to ask me a question anytime. I'm always more than willing to try to explain myself a little bit better. So thank you very much for all of your participation this evening.
I don't know if that's possible, David. You do a pretty good job explaining yourself.
I can. Still, you're right. I do have a 3-step, 4-5-step. One more.
I appreciate everybody that decided to tune in tonight. I recognize it's not always the funnest thing to do, but you know, knowing what we're talking about and participating in this conversation, I think it's important. You know, if I wasn't participating, I'd be personally watching. But and I think this is the first of many debates we'll have, or discussions even. And frankly, it's going to do a lot to refine what our policies and what our platform as a party are going to be. You know, so if you don't agree with something we have on our platform currently, write up some formal arguments for it and ask for a debate. We'll schedule it, and you can participate in one just like this.
For those of you who have not gotten it yet, you need to leave, rejoin, and then unmute your mic. Then you'll be able to talk.
Yeah, everyone is no longer server muted. So
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't know why it's that way, but it just is. It's really obnoxious.
it's a Discord thing. Although I think some people might just be muted because they aren't talking.
Yeah, like
Potentially.
everyone
So,
unmute your
who
mic
knows?
so we know that you're.
Anyway, I'm going to grab something to eat real quick. I'll be right back.
All right.
But yeah, I still believe in term limits though. So
Yeah,
don't worry,
I
you
do
still
as
have
well.
me in that realm.
You did good, Jonathan.
Well, thanks.
Well, you got shit on,
It's
but you
yeah.
tried. That's all that matters.
Yeah, I did my best. Did anybody else have any other questions that maybe you want to answer?
Yeah. Honestly, if we're going through a discussion opinion, I would suggest that maybe the issue isn't necessarily. I don't.